Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us again on the Climate Ready podcast. This is Alex Moroner here, bringing you more of the latest perspectives and trends related to international climate change issues. Once again, I'm joined by my colleague Erin Gooch.
Hello there to all our listeners. On this episode of the Climate Ready podcast, we wanted to take a closer look at the arena of international climate policy. Next month, we'll see the 23rd Conference of Parties, or COP23, for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. As is the case each year, for 12 days our collective attention turns to these hugely important climate negotiations. This year, the COP will take place in Bonn, Germany, under the presidency of Fiji.
In this episode, we are lucky to be joined by two very special guests. AGWA's coordinator, Dr. John Matthews, and the manager of international policies at Stockholm International Water Institute, as well as AGWA's co-chair, Maggie White. Let's take a listen to hear their perspectives on the state of climate policy, the role of water as a connector, a blue line in Bonn, and hopes for COP23. Stick around and you might even hear some quotes from Einstein and Voltaire. Stay tuned. The Climate Ready podcast is made possible by funding from the World Bank Group. For more on the World Bank and its role in supporting climate adaptation efforts, visit www.worldbank.org.
This is John Matthews with Climate Ready. Welcome Maggie White with AGWA, the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, and SIWI, the Stockholm International Water Institute.
Thank you, John. Happy to be here.
Maggie, I'd like to talk with you on my side as a technical specialist, someone that's been doing adaptation from a technical perspective for the last 10 or 15 years, and with you as someone who comes from, to me, an almost kind of a mystical background, the world of international and national policy, and focusing on climate issues. Even though I do some work in that area, it seems very mysterious and strange. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your background in the area, working in policy issues, and how you came to work on policy.
But I started 20 years ago, actually, looking into local development in rural areas of West Africa, working for an NGO. And what came out very strongly was that if we don't address adaptation issues, especially coming from water, and really looking at human development, but integrating the whole resources and environmental dimension, we're not going to go very far, actually. We end up having very isolated projects and programs. Very often in rural areas, you find different development programs or agencies that don't talk to each other. I mean, one village in Kornaka in Niger, for example, had the Japanese Development Agency, the French Development Agency, DFID working, but not communicating or talking to each other. So very isolated initiatives with the rural population not even being involved, and in the end just saying, oh, it's the development projects, so not actually thinking that the well that's being built is for them, and it will be for them to manage it and take care of it, or the school as well. So what happens is that if there's a problem or an issue or something breaks down, the villages are just going to wait for the project to come back and repair it. So that whole approach of ownership and actually embedding things within the local community, training them, reinforcing their capacities is essential. And you can't reach that if you have external entities coming in, not being coordinated. And that can only happen at the policy level, at the national level within a country. You can have the World Bank promoting community-based development at the international level, but if that's not integrated in the national policies of a country, or if the bank doesn't recommend that highly in their discussions with the countries in taking out a loan, that is not going to trickle down and actually be implemented. So what might seem mysterious to you on the policy level is actually where a lot of the technological approach, whether it's, sociological, anthropological, engineering, all of those different techniques have to come and be embedded and welcomed at the policy level for them actually to be mainstream and implemented in a coherent way. So initially, when I started out with local development and projects on the ground, what I realized is that if we want meaningful change, that can only happen if you bring that knowledge, that technology, that technique, that know-how to the national or the international level through policy.
That's a great answer. How is it that you moved from that initial experience, that initial level of awareness, into working on climate issues in particular?
I think you actually mentioned that once, is that climate, when it first came out, was very scientific and very much about data, knowledge, meteorological analysis. Something very far, very complex, actually quite scary. Before going into that world, we feel like we're a bit overwhelmed. And after the NGO I was working for in local development, I joined Eau de Paris, which is the water utility service for Paris. And it actually was going through its whole transformation of becoming 100% public. So remunicipalization within the capital of Paris, a big megacity, was actually a big change in the water arena and history, with the whole stakes around public-private ownership or public-private service delivery. And the whole question of what is the responsibility of a megacity, of a local authority when it comes to water service and delivery. And what was interesting with Eau de Paris was that they were not just looking at the service, so delivering clean water or the whole question around sanitation. They were actually looking at where the water was coming from. They were having a very integrated approach to where do we take the water, what are the impacts on it, whether it's pollution, droughts, and therefore starting to analyze it from a climate perspective with the impacts that we're getting. And that's when I started thinking, well, actually, climate is not that far away from us. It's our environment. But when we want to handle climate issues, everything gets compensated in that, because we're not only talking about the emissions that are coming out from our activities, but also how can we adapt, improve, and mitigate towards those emissions or the negative reverse impacts of climate. So it actually became much more clear for me how water can play a strategic role by coming in from the water delivery and drinking water perspective, and then coming more into environmental approach, and actually afterwards seeing at the delivery level when it comes to bringing water to agriculture, industry, human needs, homes, and therefore having to look at a holistic, integrated way. And that's when I felt like climate was actually a very interesting hat to put on all of that.
That's very interesting. And what it sounds like you're describing is that climate is a kind of comprehensive organizing principle that you can use to organize and prioritize a whole range of other activities. By extension, I'm assuming what you're saying is that policy becomes really important, both to incorporate climate and as an instrument for using climate to further organize and rationalize and make coherent a wide range of activities and processes. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. It's we can see it now when we have these global international agendas, actually, between the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, the Sendai framework. These are all global frameworks. They're giving indications that inspire us at the policy level very globally. And at the same time, from whatever perspective you take it from, yes, the SDG, now we're talking not only about the human development, but also protecting of the environment and Mother Earth. But all of that actually comes out to whether this biomass that we're in, this earth that we're in, it's really, climate has that encompassing element to it. And from there, you actually think about how do you bring those changes? How do we think differently? How do we adapt to this? How do we change our way of living, of consuming, of producing? And those mechanisms comes forward in the realization that our climate environment is changing, but also in what kind of policies can enable that without hindering our well-being also, and at the same time take into consideration the environment we're in.
That's a beautiful vision that you're painting. I'm recalling a conversation I had a long time ago, before I became involved marginally in some policy work, and I was talking to a lot of colleagues, most of whom were resource managers, or they worked directly with resource managers themselves. And this was in an environmental organization. I was the climate guy in the room, and I was supposed to lead a conversation with them about the role of climate in their work. And what they really wanted to talk with me about was policy. And they said, we were worried about a policy about some of the emerging global institutions like the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and some of these other groups that you've just mentioned, because we're afraid of them. We think that they are making bad judgments. They don't really understand resource management. They don't understand what our world looks like at this level, and the rumors, the indications that we have for the people who are making those policies is that they are really disconnected. They're a bullpen in a china shop, and they're going to wreck everything. You have painted this very beautiful picture, but I'd like to echo this. As a scientist, sometimes I've been in these rooms and I've looked around, and there are a lot of policy specialists, and I'm the only scientist there, and that frightens me because I know I'm not that good of a scientist. I come from a very specific point of view anyway. I would like to see more applied people or more scientifically credible people, more technical people in there that are helping to advise those policy processes. How do we make sure that policy is good policy, that it actually supports and enables good work, and B, how do we potentially even defend ourselves against policies that maybe are not very effective now and may not, at best they're incomplete, and that they haven't evolved to become helpful yet?
I think for that I have two words. One is the importance of dialogue, and the other one is being humble. I think just like you might be a bit overwhelmed by people from the policy sector are also very overwhelmed by the scientists or the people that have the know-how also, because you're very specific and you see exactly what is happening. And there's too often a gap between these two communities, and they're not talking to each other enough. And not talking to each other in a true way. I mean, the thing is that we have no way of really knowing what is happening right now and what's going to happen in the next 10 years. Because everything is so interconnected and interrelated that the fact that we're over-consuming on one end could have diabolical, disastrous effects, but in ways we don't even know at the moment. So I think we have to be humble in the fact that what's important is the vision and what we're trying to reach, but we also need to recognize that we maybe don't have all the knowledge, and what we know today might be completely different in the face of how the level of risks that are happening from hurricanes or from sea level rise and all that. We don't know, and all this applied science, we're trying to actually modulate things and trying to see in the future. It's one way. But it's one way of analyzing it according to what we have today. That's
an interesting point. I mean, I think you're not just talking about being humble in our interactions between technical or on-the-ground people and the policy sphere. You're also talking about ensuring that the policy itself is humble. Is that right?
Absolutely. We have to be humble on both sides. And I think Einstein said that we cannot fix the errors of tomorrow with the same errors that created them, or same vision. So it's really about just thinking, we don't have the solutions maybe right now, but we have to look and seek and work together to reach that, instead of coming forward being assured that we have the right answer. So I think that's the first thing is trying to be humble that we're not sure. The information we have is one kind of information, and it's relevant in a certain context, but that could change in a year's time or in 10 years' time. And therefore, that's why it's important to keep the dialogue going, saying, okay, this is what we have, but it could change. Or this is what we thought we were going to reach, but that's not what we've reached. So how are we going to adjust to that? And we need to keep that path of discussion between the people collecting the information or testing the information and the people who are supposed to digest this in order to create national policies that then influence the implementation of programs also.
Those are great points. I'll meet your Einstein quote with a good, since you're in Paris right now, with a quote from Voltaire. It's one that I ran across recently, and it immediately made me think of some of the climate policies that I have encountered. That illusion is the first of all pleasures. And I love that quote because it to me it says that actually there is a lot of illusion in how we develop climate policy. There's an illusion of confidence and certainty that we know about what the future really is going to look like, and that one of the challenges that we have is to see beyond that illusion, to actually see that the science tells us that things are happening, but it can't be that specific. It can't tell us what's going to happen in a particular place, the full ramifications of those impacts, and when they're going to happen either. It's almost a kind of a trap, I think, for policy makers to develop over certain policy.
Yes, definitely. It always has to be a movement and being willing to adjust and adapt, which is not always easy because policies do take time to digest and then be also validated. I mean, when we look at democratic processes, it always takes a very long time going through the parliament, laws being established. So there is that issue also between the emergency of the situation and the necessity to be flexible and to adapt or to transform with the democratic process of having time to validate things also. But whenever I do go to a COP, for example, and I do listen to representatives of countries and decision makers, I always feel so good and rebuffed because there's a real awareness. I mean, except for some countries who want to be troublemakers, we're not going to mention them, but the ones who really the ones who are really impacted by climate change are so aware of it, and within that country they have such beautiful visions or desires of moving forward or trying things that it's really quite interesting. And not like, I've been in this sector for about 20 years now, and already in the past 5 years I've had to change where some of the developing countries don't position themselves anymore as victims. They're positioning themselves as agents of change, that they're looking for solutions by themselves within their country or within their region also. And it's always so inspiring to hear them. And those that succeed, and I think that's one thing where there's a difference between, sometimes difficulty between the scientists and the policymakers, is that in science and scientists, they want to be very precise and specific. And when I mean scientists, it can even be an economist, for example. But everything has to be justified, has to be proved. Everything has looked into the most minute detail. But in policy, what's interesting in climate is that you have to be intersectorial. You have to be integrated. You have to link up the different sectors. And that's where policy is interesting, where you can give that push of putting around the table people from the agriculture, from the energy, from health, from water, environment, from biodiversity. And at that level, when you're trying to find solutions together, it has to be a desire, a wish for something to be improved and better. But when you're putting so many sectors together, it's very difficult to be very specific, to go to that level of detail that scientists are looking for. So it's that fine balance between the vision that you might have in policy making and what you're trying to aim, and the exactness of the information, the data, or the outputs that you might be able to reach when you're coming in from a scientific point of view. And I feel that's very often where it's quite difficult actually to bridge different sectors together, different initiatives, or to be able to establish those policies also.
Those are really interesting points. The first COP, the UNFCCC COP that I attended was Copenhagen, COP15. When was that, 2009, 2010?
2009, yeah.
I remember watching, they were restricting near the end of the COP the number of people who could enter the building. And so I had to watch some of the discussions in the plenary as things kind of came down to the wire. It looked like we were going to reach a point where we were going to go thumbs up with a good agreement or thumbs down with no agreement or a weak agreement. And tensions were very high. And the president of the Maldives stood up. The Maldives is a small island group south of India. Culturally, it has a lot in common with India and Sri Lanka. South Asia more generally. But it's a very low-lying island group. There's very little of the islands that is above 5 meters over sea level. This man, he'd been involved in climate discussions for a few years, and he was a very powerful communicator. I remember at one point he, as kind of a joke, he held a cabinet meeting, a ministerial meeting in scuba gear underwater to kind of make the point that his country was his country was so threatened by sea level rise. But he was so worried in that moment. I was in a crowded room. We were all watching this little screen, and he was making an intervention, and he just started to cry because he could see that Copenhagen was slipping away as a meeting, that it was probably going to fail, and he was right. He said, please act. It was a very powerful and disturbing moment. So I think that goes very well to this idea that you really policy is often, I think, viewed from the outside as a kind of abstract or kind of cold area, but it's really it's also a place where we're negotiating, and often we're doing so from a very passionate place with competing interests, and where we have strong feelings. There's a lot at stake. There's a lot at stake about climate change and how we do good adaptation. I have some questions for you that are about what seems to be a kind of emerging landscape. I think climate change has been viewed almost in kind of isolation, as an isolated set of projects within institutions, within countries, and a lot of practitioners. They have felt disconnected from each other, from some kind of larger image, some type of leitmotif that connects these different projects together. But it feels like, from the outside, that the language that we use to even talk about sustainable development, that we use to talk about how we do water projects or community projects or conservation projects, that climate is kind of seeping in from the edges. And I hear it coming in from finance. I hear it coming in sometimes through the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not sure how that's being connected to to a global climate policy, but there seems to be a kind of emerging connection there. And I hear it in terms of NDCs, these nationally determined contributions. Can you talk about how there seems to be this kind of larger landscape that is starting to connect global policies with actual projects?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting, what happened I find at COP21 actually, with the Paris Agreement, is that climate issues was not just about mitigation and emissions. That for me was the big changing moment to the climate arena, and that is where we see more interconnection with the other global agendas, or even the whole question of human development. And so that's a big step, and that's where this arena, this landscape is opening up to other sectors and actors, and why people who didn't say they were doing activities linked to climate are actually now realizing that they're impacting or contributing to climate issues. And what's interesting is that 2015 was just an amazing year. I mean, I'm a policy geek, and I'm just so fascinated by we have these 4 great agendas that were voted and agreed upon, which are the SDGs, the Paris Agreement, the Disaster Risk Framework designed in Sendai, and the Addis Ababa also framework for financing development. And what's interesting is that if you look at the SDG agenda, when it comes to climate, there is an SDG on climate. And all they do is actually relate and make reference to adaptation and mitigation, and then just say to revert back to the Paris Agreement, because the Paris Agreement was agreed upon after the SDGs. So there's practically nothing about climate in the SDG, even though we're talking about sustainable development. And how can you sustainably develop the environment with the earth we're living on if you don't take into consideration nature, climate, and its impacts?
I'm so glad to hear you say that.
you know. So I mean, I think that was a solution they found, thinking, okay, the SDGs are being, agreed upon at, the UN General Assembly in September 2015, but the Paris Agreement is taking place in December 2015. How do we do this? And they weren't even sure that anything was going to come out of the Paris Agreement also. So it was really risky not to put too much, to put such little reference to climate in the SDGs. Thank God the Paris Agreement came forward, it was signed, and therefore, how do you do that link now? And what's interesting, I find, is that actually the UNFCCC process is linking up with the SDG by saying that at each COP, they will address different SDGs in order to mainstream and highlight the link between the SDG agenda and the Paris Agreement. And that will be looked upon in detail at the COP. So COP coming up in Bonn, COP23, will address the issues when it comes to cities and human settlement, and when it comes to sustainable agriculture, food security, and nutrition. And for me, that's a very concrete way of moving forward and looking in detail at how each of the SDG can be addressed within the climate context, and therefore having that comprehensive approach to it. Now, this is all very at a global level and giving a framework and exchanging and coming together. But what's interesting is that the SDG are very global, and we have targets that we have to reach. The climate agreement, on the other hand, with the NDCs, so these are nationally determined contributions. These are countries saying what they're willing to do, what they can do in order to face the climate issues at the national levels, and what kind of programs or issues they feel are important to address within that country. So you have a global framework, which are the SDGs and the targets, and then you have a national framework, which are these NDCs. And what's going to be very interesting is if in the NDCs, countries start looking at the SDGs and their targets and start seeing how do we implement that and how do we report on that within our NDCs. And how do our NDCs cover all these different issues, which are in the SDGs also. So for me, the SDGs is this global vision in which we have climate, but then the implementation of them comes through the Paris Agreement and the NDCs at the national level. And that's why it's so important to really look at how these two agendas can work together and what can bridge them, because we don't want to overload countries also in reporting mechanisms when it comes to donors or to international organizations. We have to find the way to facilitate and make it more efficient for countries to be able to get funding, implement projects that have the highest return on investment and on human development that they can have.
That's a very encouraging and I think optimistic vision that you're describing.
Yeah, I'm called naive sometimes too. No, but I mean that is what we can reach. I mean, we have the tools. That's what's so fascinating right now, is that we have these amazing, beautiful tools within these global agendas, and so there's really no excuse not to reach an improved world where we don't leave anybody behind. There's no excuse for that. We have the framework. Afterwards, then of course you have the nitty-gritty details, but there is a realization of the importance of reaching these objectives.
What will you be doing in the COP in Bonn, Germany this year?
AGWA is one of these networks that actually tries to bridge between the different sectors and communities, and it's been working a lot. I mean, I think AGWA is one of the first networks that recognize the importance of water when it comes to climate issues on the adaptation and mitigation level. So CIWA and AGWA are co-coordinating the organization of the Water Action Day, and we'll be doing quite a few side events also, just to try and bridge again the water and the climate community, and then also looking at the bigger picture again, which is also source to sea and the link between fresh water and oceans. I'm linking up a lot on the urban agenda also, because water is not just about living, clean drinking water to the inhabitants of a city or of a town. It's also about the way you balance the rural and urban area, the whole impact of industries and agriculture and polluting water, therefore polluting the biodiversity also. So working a lot on those elements at the next COP, and trying to find the right entry points to increase more dialogue with the climate community and the water community. We have to remember this earth is round, it's a unit, it's interconnected. So we really have to have a global vision when we try to address the issues. Even if it's complicated, we have to respect Mother Earth enough, because she has been able to develop in such an intricate, interesting way, the way she has found her balance. And we are disturbing that balance, so we owe it to her to try and be as respectful and protective and forth-looking as possible.
Well, I wish you luck, and I will see you in Bonn. We'll touch base with you hopefully during that week to get your readout from how some of those events and processes have been going, and your sense about what you did or didn't do while you were there. Thank you very much, Maggie. And
Thank you, John.
Yeah, take care.
Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with us. We covered a ton of ground today. If you're like us and not the most well-versed in the climate policy world, I hope you took away some memorable lessons from the conversation.
Here are a few messages that I'll leave you with. National and international policy is complicated, but it's the best approach to integrate our efforts in a way that's cohesive, effective, and inclusive. Policies are designed to minimize isolated initiatives and maximize stakeholder involvement and ownership. On this podcast, we often discuss technical approaches to climate adaptation. If we really want to embed and mainstream these approaches at a scale that makes a difference, we need effective climate policy. A gap does still exist between the scientific and policy communities, but we can work across this divide if we value open dialogue and a sense of humility. Both sides should keep in mind that we don't have all the solutions right now. We need to keep the discussion going between these communities. Lastly, 2015 was a milestone year for climate policy. The scope of climate dialogue expanded beyond just emissions and mitigation. More sectors and actors have been brought into the discussion. We now have global goals through the SDGs and a means of implementing these goals through the NDCs.
As Maggie said, there's really no excuse not to reach an improved world where we don't leave anybody behind. With that, our eyes turn to Bonn and COP23. We'll have follow-up conversations based on the outcomes there in the future episodes of the Climate Ready podcast. Until then, thanks again for listening. Do you want to learn more about a specific topic related to climate change adaptation? Is there a burning question that you'd like to have answered? We'd love to hear from you, the listeners. Send us your questions and we'll feature them in our upcoming guest interviews.
Visit agwaguide.org/climateready. That's agwaguide.org/climateready to submit your questions, comments, or feedback.